In the past few weeks, we have seen how COP26, or the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, has elicited criticisms from multiple fronts. These criticisms aren't really new, but they remain relevant. The international community has made multiple commitments to limit the global rise in temperature, but many countries have not made good with their word. Yet, here they are again to make new commitments, all while we battle another crisis, the global pandemic of COVID-19. In this episode, let us step back to put the climate crisis in perspective. We ask,
Ano nga ba ang climate change?
Delikado nga ba ang lagay ng Pilipinas kaugnay ng krisis na ito?
at paano natin mako-contextualize ang krisis na ito sa ating karanasang pangkasaysayan? Sapagkat ang climate crisis,
Hindi na bago yan.
Hi, I'm Lee Candelaria,
I am Vec Alporja.
And I am Aaron Maliari.
and this is Podcast, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society. Medyo nakakatakot itong topic natin kasi totoo itong climate change na ito at malaki ang peligro lalo na ng bansa katulad ng Pilipinas sa hinaharap.
That is true. Ang dami ng pelikula about the apocalypse or post-apocalyptic world at itong patuloy na pag-init ng mundo at pagkatunaw ng mga glaciers na nagdudulot ng pagtaas ng mga karagatan, kumbaga. It is certain that archipelagic and island nations will take the brunt of the climate crisis.
Kaya rin humingi tayo ng tulong kay Dr. Doracie Zoleta Nantes, an extreme weather specialist, president of Southern Luzon State University, and member of the National Panel of Technical Experts of the Climate Change Commission of the Philippines, to help us unpack this issue. Tinanong natin siya tungkol sa dangers na kahaharapin at hinaharap ng Pilipinas kaugnay ng climate change.
How dangerous climate change induced risks can be. Of course, when we discuss this, we have to take into account yung tinatawag natin na the level of risks associated with yung climate change processes should be seen as part of, shall we say, everyday life, and that you can define the level of risk according to how they will impact several community processes, local activities that are incorporated into a number of things. One in relation to public safety, the other one is in relation to some health concerns. The other set would be economic concerns. And then some other areas pertain to food production and security, and many other things. I want to emphasize that when we talk about risks or danger associated with negative impacts that will be brought about by climate change, they have to be discussed in relation to things that pertain to how we live our daily lives. So when it comes to, say, for example, public safety, we are talking about the very close connection between how climate change processes that are affected by the increasing trend in atmospheric temperatures, which are identified as global fuels, that intensifies, say, for example, in the Philippine context, the tropical cyclones and we know we're very familiar with Bago or typhoons, and it's associated with a number of secondary hazardous events such as flooding. And then when you talk about flooding, it's associated with things as basic as drowning, disruption in transportation, and other movements associated with bringing in food supply and other resources from one area to another. And this is related also to exposing a good number of affected population to health concerns such as, it can range from communicable diseases to us maybe simple colds, and later on you can get fever and if you're exposed to waters that are contaminated with, nasabi natin, urine, okay, of rats, can lead to leptospirosis, which can develop into more serious medical condition later on. And we have, say, for example, the increase in the number of vector population ng mosquitoes, and which are to a certain extent tied up with encephalitis. All these things have economic impacts. So we know that flooding, they occur in agricultural areas. This would hamper and cause a great reduction in food production, which are primarily the source of income, okay, or sources of income of various groups of our population. And if you're going to relate it with health concerns, which I earlier enumerated, the medical bills, hospitalization if the condition is serious, or just getting the medicine to address some of the sicknesses that I enumerated at the individual level, this will be very costly. And so on matters pertaining to individual and community health, we really need to address this because they can cause wide-scale health problems. And if we're going to discuss this in the realm of or spaces associated with governance, you can imagine, the level of difficulty that will be faced by our LGUs, by the different national agencies at different levels, provincial, regional, and national, considering that our country is not as rich, particularly in this period, wherein most of our financial resources are focused on addressing a pandemic. We can say that indeed, if all these things happen now, and they have been happening before, but just to answer the question, you will have an idea of how dangerous it will be for us at an individual scale and at the, shall we say, national scale.
With this conversation with Dr. Nantes, talagang nag-focus siya sa paglala ng mga weather events. Taon-taon na tayong binabayo ng bagyo. At sa paglala ng climate crisis, magiging mas matindi pa itong mga bagyo sa Pilipinas. So we should prepare for the worst to come. At mahalagang papel ang gagampanan ng pamahalaan natin sa usaping ito.
True. Napansin ko din na nag-focus siya sa secondary hazards. Ito yung mga dangerous events that occur due to another hazard. So kapag bumagyo, hindi lang naman yan bagyo. Pwedeng magdulot yan ng pagbaha at yung pagbaha magdudulot ng iba't ibang mga sakit. Yung pagbagyo at pagbaha nakasira ng mga pananim. So affected din ang food supply. So maaari ding makasira ng mga daan at tulay. So apektado ang transportasyon. At syempre, yung direktang pagkasira ng mga ari-arian at pinakamalala, pagkawala ng buhay tulad na lamang ng storm surge, landslides at iba pa.
O, diba? Sabi nga ng kanta, ang lahat ng bagay ay magkaugnay, diba? So, para itong chain reaction. And what's interesting and disconcerting here is, maiuugat natin lahat itong mga hazards na ito sa rapid climate change. Sa pagtindi ng mga namumuong bagyo na magla-landfall sa Pilipinas, knock on wood, pero posibleng maulit nga talaga yung Yolanda or yung Typhoon Haiyan. Posibleng mas malakas pang bagyo ang tumama sa Pilipinas.
Which makes me think, how did we get into this situation? Kung titignan natin mismo yung kasaysayan ng pagka-discover sa climate change as a phenomenon, 19th century pa ito. Scientists have suspected that human emissions of greenhouse gases could change the climate. But it was only until the 1990s when science developed enough to confirm and present evidence that global warming is a thing. Mula dito, nag-expand na nga ang mga pag-aaral tungkol sa climate change.
But what caused this climate change? Hindi naman ito natural na phenomenon. So yes, the climate naturally changes, but it was sped up drastically by the West. Yes, may ugat natin ito sa mga kanluranin. And here's what Dr. Nantes had to say about it.
In fact, if you're going to look at the historical component of the global changes in the atmosphere, they were really started by the Industrial Revolution. Diba? Yung use of fossil fuels. And if you're going to look at the history of our Industrial Revolution, they definitely started from economies in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Europe, in North America, more particularly to the United States, and of course Canada, which are centers of technological development and up to now are leaders in the industrial revolution. If you're going to quantify the production of greenhouse gases associated with very active and large-scale operations of industries that are based on fossil fuels, one can really come up with a calculation of how much greenhouse gases have been contributed by these developed nations since the Industrial Revolution to the atmosphere. In fact, there are studies there that would show it, and this is the reason why in the evolution and development of calling the attention of every country to look at the amount of greenhouse gases greenhouse gases emission, and they're actually pressuring and requesting, and to a certain extent even begging these developed countries to be active participants in the reduction of greenhouse gas production, which is a total opposite of the things that are associated, say, for example, with some Pacific Island nations, wherein their level of industrialization can be considered as non-comparable to those of Northern America and Western Europe, and to a certain extent parts of East Asia and other countries as well in the different regions of the world. And yet, we are dealing here with the physical geography and characteristics of these nations in relation to where they are located. And if you're going to look at water cycle, atmospheric cycle, and they vary at different altitudes, no? And also latitudes, more specifically. These Pacific Island nations are the ones which are suffering greatly from the impacts of greenhouse gas production that happened and still is happening in various developed parts of the world.
So, imagine, ang magsasuffer talaga, sa example nga ni Dr. Nantes, ay yung mga bansa na wala naman talagang emissions or maliit yung historical emissions kumpara sa mga bansang tunay na responsable dito in the first place.
Indeed. In fact, itong Global Climate Risk Index, it identifies countries such as the Philippines, Madagascar, India, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Mozambique, Haiti, Pakistan, among others, na ito yung mga pinaka-apektado. At ang common thread sa mga bansang ito ay mukhang mahihirap sila lahat. Kung susumahin ang historical emissions nila, napakaliit kumpara sa historical contribution ng mga nakinabang ng matindi sa Industrial Revolution.
At hindi lang Industrial Revolution ha. Kasi dapat pag-usapan natin yung enterprise ng colonialism and imperialism, which is actually responsible for this.
Yes, and if we are to take a look at the trajectory of European colonial and expansionist history, talagang ecological violence ang susi nila para mapalakas ang kanilang mga imperyo. The old world went to the new world to exploit their resources. They destroyed the environment, extracted whatever they can, and left their colonies in shambles.
At nakakapanggalaiti or nakakagalit ito, ano? Kasi ang naging campaign later on ay yung we must preserve the environment. Sabi nila, yan daw yung solusyon. Pero kasi mga sis, we are not addressing the root of the problem. Struktural yung problema at nagpapatuloy yung mismong pundasyon ng pagkasira ng kalikasan.
Totoo, kung babalikan nga natin yung historical experience natin at yung environmental degradation ng bansa, may ugat din talaga natin sa kolonyalismo. Sabi nga ni Dean Worcester, when they saw the forests of the Philippines, they were like money in the bank. Diba? Verbatim yan sabi ni Dean Worcester. And after the US occupation, yung damage sa environment na iniwan ng mga Amerikano, napakalala. The United States did more damage in its 40 years of deforesting the Philippine archipelago than Spain did in over 3 centuries.
And then, poor Philippines, left to fend for itself after the war, heavily turned to forest exploitation din. Probably they thought that, the forest naturally replenishes, kaya walang restriction sa forest exploitation. And by the 1970s, 170,000 hectares of forests were destroyed per year. So finally, nirestrict na nila ang commercial logging. Pero take note kung sino yung Pangulo ng Pilipinas nung nagaganap itong malawakang deforestation ng ating bansa. Nung panahon ni Marcos, an average of 2.5% of Philippine forests were disappearing every year, which was triple the worldwide deforestation rate. At sino nakinabang dyan? Siyempre, mga cronies ni Marcos.
By the way, we talk about degradation of the environment kasi may malinaw din itong link, of course, sa climate change at climate crisis.
And we must also highlight na yung mga bansang naghirap dahil sa Western colonial and imperial complex, when it was their turn to rely on extractive industries to develop their economies, pinupulis na sila ngayon ng Western countries. Tipong, hoy, mga global warming, tigil nyo yung mga emissions nyo. So, paano na ngayon? Kayong mga kanluranin, nakinabang kayo, tapos ngayong mayaman na kayo, hindi na namin pwedeng gamitin yung means of developing our economies that you relied on. Diba? So, the irony.
Kaya nga malaking usapin ng climate justice. Kasi sa totoo lang, climate change is an inherently social issue as it can upset anyone's daily life in countless ways. But not all climate impacts are created equal or distributed equally. Lalo na yung effect nito on historically marginalized or underserved communities or mga post-colonial countries.
At itong climate justice, isa itong movement na kinikilala yung pagkakaiba ng effect at impact ng climate change according sa kasaysayan. At hindi lang yan, pati yung iba-ibang epekto ng climate change sa mga underprivileged populations. This is what Dr. Nantes said about this.
Tingnan mo naman, pag binaha ang isang area na mayroong mayaman at mahirap, makikita mo pagdating sa rehabilitation process, yung mayayaman, pwede silang mag-elevate ng foundation ng kanilang bahay. Yung mahirap, wala. Okay? Saan sila kukuha ng pagtataas ng level ng living space sa mga tahanan ng mayayaman? Nangyayari yan sa tahanan ng mahihirap. Napakahirap niyang gawin kasi kailangan mo ng pera sa pagpaparepair ng iyong tahanan. At kung halimbawa talagang nakita ng mayayaman na ay talagang taon-taon ay mangyayari to, they have the resources to move and relocate into another area and they have the money to buy piece of property there and build a safer residential structure para hindi sila maapektuhan ng flood events. In some cases, hindi na nga nila kailangan na bumili ng lupa kasi usually mayayaman. May may lupa na mamimili pa sila kung saan sila magtatayo ng panibagong daan. And then it's incorporated into a number of related things. Ipasok ulit natin yung concerns. This is one of the things that we're going to emphasize, yung aming panel ngayon ng technical experts. We are really going to highlight the importance of integrating it with health concerns. Kasi this is something that is under research. Hindi lang yung concerns sa health problems ng individual, pero yung concerns ng community health, who has money to afford hospitalization, who has money to get screened, to have these medical checkups.
This is the reality of our society, If you're wealthy, these issues such as flooding, it doesn't really affect you that much. You can always move somewhere better. May pera ka Pwede mo rin itaas yung bahay mo. Pero kapag mahirap ka, wala kang magagawa. 'Di ba? Ang saklap.
And this is how we should understand this phenomenon. Ang hirap kasing isipin kung paano nga ba natin ipauunawa sa ordinaryong mamamayan na Hoy, itong issue ng climate change, mahalaga to. How do we explain to the general public that they should care? Na yung future natin, ng mga anak natin, ng susunod na henerasyon, ay nasa kamay ng mga state leaders na nag-uusap annually.
Na nag-iit siya ng coin sa fountain to wish for a better climate future, diba?
Actually, sobrang out of touch niyan, ano? Why did they have to do that? But yeah, tulad ng coins na inihagis ng, I think, group of 20 major economies sa Trevi Fountain sa Italy. Dito lang nakaraang buwan. Literal na nasa kamay pa rin ng mayayamang bansa ang kinabukasan ng sangkatauhan. At parang nilalaro nila tayo.
And I agree with Dr. Nantes. Talagang sa pamamagitan ng pagdidiin sa on-the-ground manifestations ng climate change, sa hazards at secondary hazards, sa health issues, sa inequality in society, baka nga sa ganitong paraan, mas mauunawaan natin na oo nga, dapat itama natin yung historical injustice na to. At syempre, babalik at babalik din tayo sa mga structural foundations ng inequalities na naranasan natin sa lipunan.
So speaking of pagtatama ng injustices at inequalities, paparating na ang eleksyon. Paano nga ba natin i-engage ang mga kandidato natin sa usapin ng climate change?
It's good to educate the young and the not so young, or shall we say the different cohorts in our population, that indeed climate change is happening, and these are the things that we can expect from these climate change processes. What are the impacts and how are they related to things that or events that we experience on a yearly basis, on a seasonal basis, and make them aware that when we talk about climate change issues, it's interrelated with a good number of concerns regarding, first, environmental management associated with the protection of forests and other areas which are considered as part of the watershed that collect and receive water that feed our underground or the aquifers where we derive groundwater from. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. But, I always believe that education, providing information, will have its way in making good decisions. Say, for example, prioritizing concerns like prevention of diseases that are brought about by increasing incidences of flooding that bring in waste, yung mga solid waste that we put in our waterways, in our backyard, okay, or in our front door, kasi that happens, di ba? Na pag nagbaha, makikita mo ang dumi ng bahay mo or paligid ng bahay mo. So how do we make this more obvious to the voters, no? The reason why this is happening is because we're not doing what we're supposed to do, and that is elect somebody who can really deliver good governance. And when we talk about governance, environmental governance is a very important component of that. In this manner, if we provide good education, not only to voters, but those who will aspire for government positions or elected posts, we can always hope, and then you can criticize this as being so idealistic. But, at all times, we have to trust na indeed knowledge can transform, and this applies to everybody. So, having said that, we need to incorporate discussions and engage the candidates to similar forms of debate and presentation of programs pertaining to climate change related concerns, which can be discussed in terms of things that we experience ourselves, and that is flooding incidences, health problems, which are tied up with the things that I have explained earlier.
I agree with Dr. Nantes, and I think we have underlined the point na nga na we should engage at the level of the everyday manifestations of climate change, like flooding, among other potential disasters. But more than that, nabanggit din ni Dr. Nantes yung kahalagahan ng education. We should educate ourselves about climate change and the climate crisis and the hazards involved with it. Para din we can demand from our leaders that they should prioritize.
And we're lucky that we have a panel of experts kasama si Dr. Nantes no, sa Climate Change Commission that informs and lends their expertise to the government regarding this pressing issue. Pero sa tingin ko, mahalaga rin na sa paparating na eleksyon, mag-demand tayo ng agenda on climate change and the environment from our next leaders. Dapat maniwala sila sa science at evidence-based decision-making kaugnay ng climate change at maging sa ibang mga usapin na may connection sa kaligtasan at kalusugan ng mamamayang Pilipino, dapat science at evidence-based ang decision-making dyan.
Pero dapat din magamit natin yung leverage natin as a vulnerable country to take the centrality of the political conversations and negotiations surrounding climate change, especially in the international level. Bakit ano? Kasi sobrang apektado tayo. Yun lang naman yun. Kailangan natin ng maayos at karespe-respetong representasyon in the international stage if we want to make our needs known. Syempre, kaisa ng marami pang mga bansang mataas ang ranking sa risk index dahil sa climate change.
And with that, we end another episode of Hindi na Bago Yan. Sana may napulot at natutunan kayo sa episode na ito. We would like to thank Dr. Doracie Zoleta Nantes for lending us her expertise for this episode. If you want to hear our full interview with Dr. Nantes, head on over to our website, podcast.org.
As always, you can find us in all major social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can view our episodes on YouTube as well. Just search for Podcast TV.
So that's it for today. We'll catch you on the next one and have a good day.